will not be deterred. We are, as South Africans, a resilient people, and we will not be bullied.
In a bold declaration that is reverberating across continents and challenging the established order of global diplomacy, South Africa has drawn a line in the sand that Washington cannot ignore. South Africa has categorically refused to travel to the United States for the ceremonial transfer of the G20 presidency.
Sunday with this statement from Donald Trump.
Terrible things are happening in South Africa. They're taking away land, they're confiscating land. And actually, they're doing things that are perhaps far worse than that.
The U.S. president offered no proof of his claim, but threatened to cut off all funding to South Africa. Trump appeared to be reacting to a land expropriation law enacted last month by South African President Cyril Ramaphosa.
And that has kicked off a big diplomatic feud, a feud between the United States of America and South Africa. Here's how it began. South Africa hosted the G20 summit this year. It was a big deal for them. For the first time ever, an African country was playing host. But Donald Trump ruined their moment. He boycotted the summit. He did not attend the event. He did not even send a senior representative. And you can imagine how
Previously believed. It's becoming obvious who needs whom as African governments prevent Western countries from exporting. The squeeze is being felt in the West. US President Donald Trump recently cut foreign aid to Africa, further underscoring the changing dynamics between the continent and the West. But rather than weakening African nations, this decision is fueling their resolve to break free from economic dependence.
Is my view. I just don't understand why we are taking a bunch of tools in our foreign policy toolbox and tossing them into a dumpster.
And I think we need to start giving African countries more of what they want and less of what they don't. That seems like an obvious proposition, but frequently our Africa strategy doesn't seem to be guided by that principle.
Picking a fight with South Africa, a pretty important nation, and labeling them as committing genocide against African.
Donald Trump has found a new enemy because South Africa, along with the European Union and China, are making moves. They want to punish America's biggest tech.
Many countries in the North count their assets in the mineral resources that are beneath the African soil. The wealth of Africa belongs to Africans. Centuries after the end of the slave trade, decades after the end of the colonial exploitation of Africa's resources, the people of our continent are once again bearing the cost of industrialization of the North and the development of the wealthy nations of the world. This is a price that the people of Africa are no longer prepared to pay. Many countries in the North count their assets in the mineral resources that are beneath the African soil. The wealth of Africa belongs to Africans. The mineral wealth that is beneath the soil of Africa must, in the end, accrue to Africans. We urge global leaders to accelerate the global decarbonization while pursuing equality and shared prosperity. We need to advance all three pillars of the Paris Agreement: mitigation, adaptation, and support, with equal ambition and urgency.
The announcement came first from South Africa, but within hours it had swept across the entire African continent like a silent earthquake that rattled capitals from Washington to Brussels. In Pretoria, officials delivered the message with a calm clarity that made foreign observers uneasy. They said the decision was final, strategic, and long overdue. Africa was banning several categories of U.S. products, and the embargo would extend across nations in the African Continental Free Trade Area. The goods listed were not random. They were chosen with surgical precision, based on decades of economic patterns that had tilted far too heavily in one direction. U.S. poultry, American corn, wheat, pharmaceuticals, vehicles, processed foods, and industrial equipment were now restricted from entering African ports. What made the shockwave even stronger was that South Africa was not acting alone. Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Senegal, Egypt, Algeria, Morocco, and Angola all signed on. The continent was making a unified economic stand, and the world could not ignore it. The reasons were layered. Some African leaders said it was retaliation for years of unfair trade practices. Others said it was about protecting local industries. Many said it was a strategic realignment Africa wanted to industrialize on its own terms. The continent had grown tired of foreign goods suffocating local production. For decades, cheap imported chicken from the United States had undercut poultry farmers in West Africa. Subsidized American corn had weakened local grain markets. U.S. pharmaceutical giants had priced essential medicines far beyond the reach of ordinary citizens. American car companies had dumped outdated models into African markets at the expense of emerging African automakers. The ban was not emotional. It was strategic. America had taken Africa for granted for far too long, and Africa had decided it would not remain an economic afterthought in a world shifting toward multipolar balance. In Washington, disbelief filled the room as advisors scrambled to brief officials. No one expected Africa to make such a bold, coordinated move. For years, the continent had been treated as a market to be influenced, not a power block capable of disrupting global supply chains. Analysts combed through data, searching for vulnerabilities. But what they found frightened them. The U.S. exported billions of dollars worth of goods to Africa every year, and while those exports were not the backbone of the American economy, they supported crucial sectors: agriculture, pharmaceuticals, manufacturing, logistics, and shipping. And beyond the direct revenue, U.S. companies relied on Africa as an expanding market that absorbed surplus production during domestic downturns. Without Africa, American companies would face oversupply problems that could trigger layoffs and factory slowdowns. But the deeper threat lay in Africa's role as a geopolitical swing continent. The ban signaled a shift in allegiance. Africa was aligning itself with new partners: China, India, Brazil, the Gulf states, who offered technology transfers, fairer trade terms, and massive infrastructure investments. Soon after the ban, ports in Lagos, Durban, Mombasa, Tema, and Alexandria refused entry to U.S. poultry shipments. Cargo vessels filled with frozen chicken parts were ordered to reroute or return home. For decades, the U.S. poultry industry had relied on Africa as a destination for surplus dark meat, wings, and chicken feet that Americans rarely consumed. Without the African market, those goods had nowhere to go. Prices collapsed, cold storage facilities overflowed. Farmers protested in the Midwest, accusing Washington of negligence. Corn producers faced a similar nightmare. America's agricultural sector depended heavily on exports, and Africa had been one of the fastest-growing markets for U.S. corn. Now, African countries turned to Brazil, Argentina, and domestic grain production initiatives backed by new agricultural reforms. Farmers across Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, and Illinois were hit with rising storage costs, falling grain prices, and loss of revenue. News channels in the U.S. Midwest described the ban as a continental earthquake, and grain lobby groups demanded an emergency summit. But South Africa's role made the crisis even more severe. As the most industrialized African nation, its ban on U.S. vehicles, machinery, and chemical products sent shockwaves through the American manufacturing sector. U.S. automakers depended on South Africa as a key market for mid-tier vehicle models that sold poorly at home but performed well abroad. Without African customers, factories in Michigan, Ohio, and Kentucky began scaling down production. Executives tried to pivot to Latin America and Southeast Asia, but those markets were not big enough to absorb the sudden overflow. Inventory piled up in warehouses. U.S. dealerships reported dropping sales. Workers feared layoffs, and the pharmaceutical ban struck the deepest nerve of all. Africa had long been dependent on imported medicines, many of them produced in America. The continent's decision to turn toward India and domestic pharmaceutical expansion was both symbolic and disruptive. American drug manufacturers entered panic mode. Billions of dollars in projected revenue evaporated overnight. Stock prices dipped. Analysts warned that losing a continent with over 1 billion consumers could cripple research funding for future projects. But the real blow came when Africa announced something even more profound. The continent would be implementing a local industry protection framework, incentivizing African-made goods and imposing heavy restrictions on foreign imports that undermine domestic production. This framework was designed to stimulate African manufacturing and reduce dependency on external markets. For the United States, the message was brutal but clear. The era of dominance was over. In a televised address, economic analysts explained that the ban was not merely about products. It was about power, leverage, and long-term positioning. For decades, Africa had been seen as a passive participant in global trade, but now it was making decisions that reshaped the economic architecture of the world. In Johannesburg, a coalition of African ministers met to discuss the next phase of the ban. They reviewed data showing how African farmers were experiencing increased prices and demand now that foreign poultry and grains had been restricted. New processing plants were being set up in Kenya and Nigeria to reduce reliance on foreign processed foods. Ethiopia expanded its industrial parks, attracting manufacturing investments from Asian partners eager to fill the gap left by the United States. The African Union released a statement declaring that the ban was not a punishment, but a recalibration of economic relationships. The continent was moving towards self-reliance, industrial sovereignty, and value addition policies that would ensure long-term prosperity. Yet behind the diplomatic language was a truth everyone understood. Africa had grown tired of being dependent. American businesses felt the sting hardest. Small and medium-sized companies that relied on African customers were suddenly cut off. Agricultural cooperatives struggled to find alternative buyers. Poultry farms announced layoffs. Food processing companies reported supply chain imbalances. Logistics firms operating Atlantic routes lost millions as shipping volumes dropped. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce warned that the ban could trigger a recession in sectors deeply tied to export markets. Economists debated whether the U.S. government should attempt negotiations, retaliate through counter-sanctions, or seek arbitration through international trade organizations. But retaliation proved complicated. America could not easily sanction a whole continent without isolating itself from a massive emerging market, and Africa, strengthened by alliances with Asia and South America, was not vulnerable to the same pressures it once was. In Dakar, ministers from Senegal and Morocco signed new trade agreements involving textiles, electronics, and construction materials. In Nairobi and Kigali, delegations from India discussed setting up joint pharmaceutical production lines aimed at supplying affordable medicine across East Africa. In Algeria and Egypt, negotiations with China accelerated to expand electric vehicle manufacturing using African minerals and Chinese technology. Africa was not retreating into isolation, it was diversifying, and the United States was the loser in this new arrangement. As months passed, American politicians began receiving desperate letters from farmers, manufacturers, and small businesses demanding intervention. There were protests in states whose economies depended heavily on exports. Grain storage facilities overflowed. Poultry warehouses struggled to manage excess stock. Workers feared losing their jobs. Washington convened emergency trade meetings. Officials attempted to reach out to African leaders, but the responses were firm. The ban would remain until the United States agreed to fairer trade terms and acknowledged Africa's right to industrialize without interference. The American government hesitated, admitting that Africa deserved economic autonomy would require confronting decades of geopolitical imbalance, but the pressure grew too intense to ignore. Meanwhile, Africa thrived under its new strategy. Domestic industries expanded. Local farmers earned higher profits. Youth employment increased as manufacturing zones opened. African factories began producing goods that once had to be imported from overseas. In Accra, an assembly plant launched a line of locally manufactured agricultural machinery. In Dar es Salaam, a consortium unveiled the continent's first locally branded electric bus made with African components. In Cairo, pharmaceutical labs celebrated new breakthroughs that dramatically reduced production costs. Africa's message to the world became clearer each day. The continent was not simply a market, it was a rising industrial power. By the one-year mark, the United States found itself in a position that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. It was lobbying African nations for market access, pleading for a renegotiation of trade terms. Officials traveled to Addis Ababa, hoping to negotiate a partial lifting of the ban. But Africa had leverage now. It had alternatives. It had partners. It had a plan. The American delegation left the meeting with no promises, only an understanding that the world had changed and Africa had changed it. Back home, analysts admitted the truth on national broadcasts. America had underestimated Africa's economic potential for far too long. The ban had exposed structural weaknesses in the U.S. economy, proving that even a global superpower could be shaken when emerging markets coordinated their strategies. And as Africa continued to build its industries, protect its markets, and strengthen its continental alliances, the world prepared for a future where economic power was distributed more evenly, no longer concentrated in the West, but shared among nations that had once been ignored. The ban did more than shake the American economy. It rewrote the global narrative. Africa was not rising. Africa had risen. The aftermath of Africa's coordinated ban on U.S. goods left the global economy in a state of reevaluation. What began as a strategic move to protect local industries had grown into a continental declaration of sovereignty, one that permanently altered the trajectory of international trade. Across Africa, the results of the ban were not merely economic statistics but lived realities. Farmers in West Africa saw their incomes rise as reliance on foreign poultry and grain diminished. Manufacturing hubs in East Africa expanded their production lines, supplying everything from pharmaceuticals to industrial components that once arrived on ships from overseas. In southern Africa, the ban triggered a renaissance in heavy industry. Factories that had been dormant for decades were revived to meet local demand. American machinery that once dominated African markets had been replaced by locally assembled alternatives or imports from Asian partners offering joint ownership models. For the first time, Africa was setting the terms of engagement rather than accepting the terms dictated by external powers. Diplomatically, the ban created new momentum. African leaders realized the power of unity, and the African Continental Free Trade Area became more than a symbolic agreement. It became a mechanism for collective strength. Policies that once required individual country negotiations were now being coordinated at the continental level, giving Africa a negotiating power it had never enjoyed before. The world watched as Africa behaved not as a collection of nations but as a geopolitical bloc capable of influencing supply chains and shifting global alliances. For the United States, the conclusion was painful yet enlightening. The ban exposed vulnerabilities that many experts believed didn't exist. America had assumed that its economy was too large, too diversified, and too powerful to be shaken by emerging markets. But Africa's decision proved otherwise. The U.S. agricultural industry learned that it could no longer rely on African markets to absorb surplus stock. Manufacturers realized that African consumers were no longer passive buyers but strategic partners with rising expectations. Pharmaceutical companies faced a harsh reminder that monopolies do not last forever, especially when regions begin prioritizing domestic capacity. The American government eventually acknowledged the need for a reset. It became clear that the old model based on one-sided trade advantages and geopolitical dominance was unsustainable. Analysts in Washington finally began recommending policies that reflected respect rather than entitlement. Proposals for new trade agreements emerged, focusing on technology exchanges, local manufacturing partnerships, and fair market practices. The shift was slow, but it signaled a recognition that the global order had evolved, and yet the greatest transformation occurred within Africa itself. The ban sparked a wave of confidence that no foreign investment could buy. Young Africans saw industries grow at home and began envisioning futures that did not involve migration or dependence. Entrepreneurs launched startups focused on agriculture, manufacturing, renewable energy, and biotechnology. Governments invested heavily in research and development, pushing African universities to the forefront of innovation. Infrastructure, once neglected, received unprecedented funding. With every passing month, Africa became not merely a participant in global economics but an architect of its own destiny. The continent's ability to disrupt the American economy demonstrated that Africa's relevance was no longer tied to raw materials alone. It was tied to its population, its innovation, its purchasing power, and its rising industries. Africa's ban on U.S. products became a historical turning point, a moment future generations would study as the spark that altered global power dynamics. It marked the end of an era defined by dependency and the beginning of an era defined by strategic autonomy. The world now understood that ignoring Africa came at a cost. Respecting Africa, partnering with Africa, and recognizing Africa's ambitions were not optional, they were essential. In the global halls of policy and power, one truth resonated louder than all others. Africa was no longer the margin of the world economy. It had become one of its centers, And from that center, the continent was reshaping the world not through conflict or force, but through vision, unity, and the unshakable realization of its own. Potential Africa had risen, and this time it would not step back.